Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
I had just enrolled in online classes and was struggling to find a quiet spot in my home to focus. Between the noisy neighbors, the kids running around, and the constant distractions of daily life, there was no way I could get any studying done. It felt like every time I opened my books, something would demand my attention. I needed a place where I could work in peace, without all the interruptions. That's when I had the idea to start using the billiards room at our community clubhouse. It wasn't the most conventional study spot, but it was quiet, and more importantly, no one seemed to use it much. Plus, it was a common area that was open to all residents. It seemed like the perfect solution. I spoke with a few members of the HOA, and they didn't seem to mind the idea at all. In fact, one of them handed me 2 calendars, one with the schedules for resident events, and another with the board meetings. I was told I could use the room as long as it wasn't already booked. I could even use the calendars to make sure the space was available, as long as I didn't shut the room off from others, and used it only when there were no events or meetings scheduled. I was good to go. At first it was perfect. The room had a nice big table, and I could spread out all my books and notes without worrying about anyone else disturbing me. I'd take my coffee, sit down with my laptop, and dive into my assignments. It was peaceful. It was exactly what I needed. But then everything changed. A month into my studying routine, the HOA made a huge purchase. A new $5,000 billiards table for the room. It didn't take long for things to start getting weird after that. I hadn't even touched the table, but suddenly the whole vibe of the place felt different. There were new rules being thrown around that didn't make sense to me. It started with the whispers. The board began telling me that I would have to reserve the room ahead of time if I wanted to use it. Fine, I thought. It's a popular space now with the new table, so maybe they just wanted to keep things organized. But then they told me I would have to pay $100 every time I wanted to use the room. Not only was this frustrating, but it felt unfair. I had been using it without issue for weeks, and now they were charging me. I asked why, and the excuses they gave were nothing short of ridiculous. They claimed that I had somehow left crumbs in the room. I had never once brought food into that room. I didn't even have time for snacks while studying. They also mentioned that the decoration committee was upset because I moved some of the decorations around. Again, this made no sense. I always put things back where I found them, even using a ladder to make sure everything was just right. And as far as I could tell, the decorations were left up for weeks at a time, gathering dust. But none of that seemed to matter. They insisted I'd somehow broken all these unspoken rules. The worst part was when they suddenly started making it clear that the room was only for their use. One of the board members came up to me and said, "We have some important meetings in there, and you should really let us have priority." Priority? This was a public space. If anyone had a claim to the room, it should be the residents, not a select few board members. It got even more bizarre when they set out a specific table for me to use. It wasn't even close to the billiards table, and it wasn't comfortable. It was small, and the chair was one of those cheap plastic ones that make your back ache after a while. The nerve! They were treating me like a second-class citizen in my own community. I had spent weeks working in this room and keeping it clean, but now I was being pushed aside like I didn't belong. To top it off, they began telling me that I could no longer use the room at all unless I followed these new arbitrary rules. The table was off limits unless I reserved it first, and I was even told I couldn't be in the room while they were having board meetings. Never mind the fact that the doors to the room were wide open during those meetings. And the noise from the game of pool they were playing was always enough to break my concentration anyway. But now, they expected me to stay out completely, as if I didn't pay the same HOA fees as everyone else. I felt like I was being punished for trying to make a peaceful environment out of the only space that was available. It wasn't even about the studying anymore. It was about the principle of it all. How could they just change the rules overnight and start using our community funds for their own personal use? They'd spent thousands on a new billiard table, and suddenly I was the problem for using the room the way it had been designated for. How could I fight back? They'd already taken something so simple from me, and they weren't even apologetic about it. I tried talking to a few neighbors about it, hoping they'd have some insight or at least be sympathetic. But it was like nobody cared. The HOA had them all under its thumb. Every time I mentioned how unfair it was, people just shrugged it off. "It's just how things are here," they'd say. "You should have known the HOA would pull this kind of stuff." But I had been using the space long before the new table arrived, And this wasn't just some random new rule that applied to everyone. It felt like they were targeting me for no reason other than their own petty agenda. I even looked into the legal side of things. I researched whether the HOA could suddenly impose these fees and whether they had the right to make these changes without a vote from the community. But all I could find were vague answers. Sure, they had the authority to regulate shared spaces, but could they really go this far? Could they change the rules without any input from the people who lived here? The more I thought about it, the more it frustrated me. This wasn't just about a study room anymore. This was about an HOA that had overstepped its bounds, taken control, and started treating residents like pawns in their little game. I didn't want to give up that room. I needed that space to get my work done, and I wasn't going to let them take it from me without a fight. But even as I prepared to take action, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a losing battle. The board had all the power, and I was just one person. Would anyone even listen if I tried to stand up to them? Would anyone care? The last time I went to the clubhouse, I stood in front of the door to the billiards room, staring at it like it was a locked fortress. I could hear the laughter from the other side, the clinking of pool balls, and the faint murmur of a meeting going on. The door was wide open, just like it always had been, but I knew I wasn't welcome. The space I had used for weeks, the space that had become my sanctuary, was no longer mine. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder how far they would go next. Would they ban everyone from the clubhouse if they weren't on the approved list? Would they just continue making up rules to suit their whims, without any regard for the residents who had been there long before they took over? Whatever happened, I knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. I couldn't afford a lawyer, and I quickly realized that trying to fight this battle would be a long, expensive, and ultimately pointless fight. The HOA had all the power. They controlled the funds, the rules, and the enforcement. I wasn't about to waste what little energy I had left on something I knew I couldn't win. I stopped using the room, but it still gnawed at me. It wasn't just about the room anymore. It was about standing up for myself and not letting them take everything. But what was I supposed to do? I had no other options. A couple of weeks after I gave up trying, the inevitable happened. Someone broke the brand new $5,000 billiard table. The rumor was that one of the board members had been hosting a private gathering in the room, and somehow one of their guests had knocked the table during a heated game. It was wrecked. The beautiful new table was ruined, and the board was scrambling to cover up the damage. They tried to pin the blame on reckless use of the room, but it didn't matter. It was a little too convenient that the table broke right after the board had acted like they owned the place. People started whispering. Even some of the other residents who had been silent during the whole ordeal began to make sarcastic comments about the wonderful investment they'd made in the table. It felt like karma, and as much as I hated seeing it happen, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in the chaos. The HOA's credibility started to take a hit. Suddenly, the same board members who had been so quick to enforce their new rules were scrambling to save face, dealing with complaints about the table, the ongoing fees for using the room, and the growing resentment from the community. Residents who had stayed quiet now openly questioned how the money was being spent. The board tried to sweep everything under the rug, but the damage had been done. In the end, I never used the room again. I studied at home, on the couch, at the kitchen table, or wherever I could find peace. It wasn't ideal, but it was mine. The HOA kept pushing their rules and trying to control everything, but at least I didn't have to play their game anymore. And as for the billiards table, it was never quite the same after the break. They fixed it up, of course, but it never quite lived up to its once pristine glory. People stopped using it, and the room sat mostly empty, gathering dust. The board still tried to hold on to their control, but the damage to their reputation was done. It was almost like the universe had found a way to balance things out. The space I once fought so hard for was gone, but somehow I felt a little bit of relief. Maybe they won the battle, but the cracks in their empire were starting to show. As long as the rules are applied consistently for all homeowners, I think they can adopt whatever rules they want governing the common areas. The key here is consistency. If the HOA wants to create rules for the use of shared spaces like the clubhouse, they're well within their rights to do so. However, the moment those rules are applied unevenly or selectively, they lose their legitimacy. If one person is allowed to use a space freely while another is charged or restricted, that's when the system breaks down. The entire purpose of having an HOA is to ensure that all residents are treated equally and fairly under the same set of guidelines. What's important is that these rules don't change on a whim. If the board decides to implement a new policy, it should be clearly communicated to everyone, with no room for confusion or exceptions. The rules should be transparent and available to all residents, and everyone should be held accountable to them equally, no matter who they are. If the board suddenly starts changing the rules to serve their own interests or to give special privileges to certain residents, that's when things become problematic. Ultimately, the HOA has a responsibility to serve the community, not just to enforce its own agenda. If they're able to adopt rules governing shared spaces but do so in a way that benefits everyone, without favoritism or confusion, then I think that's fair. But if there's any sign of unequal treatment or favoritism, that's when the system becomes corrupt and people start feeling like they're being taken advantage of. So while they do have the power to make rules, it's how they manage and enforce those rules that determines whether they're truly doing their job right. I had a similar situation recently. It's frustrating because, just like you said, they've been applying these new rules to me without informing the rest of the community. There was a general notice about the pool area that everyone had to sign, but nothing about the new rules for the one room. They've only told me verbally, and now they've set aside a special table just for me. These specific rules seem to apply only to me, and I've done nothing wrong. If anything, I've been too nice and accommodating, always grateful for the chance to use the room. But now, after one board member returned from vacation, everything changed. Suddenly, I'm faced with all these new restrictions. It feels personal. What really got under my skin was hearing her go on and on about how entitled today's youth are, all while she's blocking a student from using a space to study. She went on for over an hour at the counter, trashing people trying to better themselves, all while making it impossible for me to work. It took everything in me not to snap at her, but I kept my cool. I wanted to shut her out, but instead, I left the door open, letting others in, while trying to stay as professional as possible.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.